Okay, so let's take a look at some of the organisms that we can see during the Cretaceous. So one organism that definitely dominates the Cretaceous, as we said, were coccolithophores, and they are definitely a type of plankton that we can see. So diatoms and silicoflagellates definitely make their appearance in the Cretaceous. And here's what those coccolithophores look like. To me, I think they look like the Death Star, but as you can see, right, they're these small organisms. They're about the size of the head of a pin, to give you a good idea. And you can see they're nice and round. They've got all these plates, right, that are stacked on top of each other. And that's essentially what's helping make all of that chalk. We also talked about rudists. So mollusks are definitely all over the place at this time. So we see some oysters in the Cretaceous, but mostly what we see are these guys, which are rudists. And rudists are really strange because if you remember, right, bivalves have that symmetry where one shell is mirror image of the other shell. However, we don't see that with our rudists. They're one of the only organisms that don't have it. Their body plan is like a garbage can. So they have one big shell and they have one little shell on top, which you can see, right? There's the little shell, there's the big shell. So one is definitely not mirror image of the other. But it's essentially the same as like an oyster. It's a filter feeder. Remember, they make the big reefs, right, at this point in time. Another interesting adaptation that we see in the Cretaceous are predatory gastropods. And I know we've talked about gastropods in class, right? Those are snails. But at this time, we start to see them become predatory. So if you take a look at this shell, you see this hole here in this shell. And this is from a snail that's literally drilled into the hole of that shell, and it has sucked out the lophophore of the bivalve that's in there. So that's pretty cool. Now we're moving into question number 43. So in the Mesozoic, we start to see our fish lose some of their ancestral traits and become a little bit more derived. But we're going to see fish that kind of still have some characteristics of both. So let's take a look at some of these primitive versus advanced traits. So some primitive traits that our fish still have is a lot of them will have diamond-shaped scales. Right? That's a primitive trait. The scales that have no overlap, right? So they're just quite literally right next to each other. Right? So there is no overlap at all. Which really, if you think about it, the scales are like plated armor. So if this fish bends, well, it's leaving part of its skin exposed. So obviously that's not a good thing, right? The skeletons are pretty much all, or at least partially cartilaginous, right? There's very few bones, definitely showing its flexibility. Very primitive jaws and asymmetrical tails. So if you want a great example of a fish today that still retains all of its primitive traits, well, there they are, the alligator gar, right? You can go anywhere in Louisiana here and find the alligator gar. They're delicious. But they're definitely all over the place. As you can see, they've got the diamond-shaped scales. They've got this really long jaw, right, which is very, very primitive. And you can't see it back here, but they have an asymmetrical tail. So this fish definitely retains all of the primitive characteristics. Now, if we want to take a look at a fish that's a little bit more advanced, right, if you have an advanced trait, first of all, you have a swim bladder. Right, so a swim bladder is what what the fish use to move gas around, and it helps the fish go up and down. Obviously, the fish has, fins which help it go back and forth, but to go up and down, it uses its swim bladder, right, to go up and down. The scales are much more rounded, as you can see here in the picture, and they actually overlap each other, kind of like roofing shingles, right, which definitely help. They definitely have symmetrical tails, right, as well, as you can see, so that'll help it swim a lot more fast and much more powerful. Some of them have specialized fins. So when we talk about sharks, right, certain sharks have specialized fins. The male sharks, they have clasper fins, which help hold the female in place, right, while they're mating. So there's a lot of fish like this that have very specialized fins. And you can see that they have very, very short jaws. So just about any fish that you could eat or catch today is definitely one that has these advanced traits. So let's take a look at some marine reptiles that are around at this time as well. So one marine reptile that evolves during this time and is only really around at this time are ichthyosaurs. So we're moving into question 44. Ichthyosaurs are pretty cool. They're definitely the most fish-like. As you can see, they actually have a dolphin-like body. The main difference here is a dolphin's tail goes up and down, and a reptile's tail and the ichthyosaur's tail goes side to side. But they have the same body plan. So when we see something like that, that's telling us that this is a body plan that works really well. This is very well suited and very, very well adapted to its environment. But if we take a look at the fossil here, we can see a couple of cool things. First of all, it has very large eyes, right, which is telling us that this is an animal that goes down very deep, right, inside the water. It needs all the light that it can. We also see, if you notice, there's this dark outline that goes around the ichthyosaur. That's actually a body outline, which is cool, right? So it's showing us, right, essentially how thick the skin and the muscle was. So that's pretty cool. Now, really, the most impressive thing about the ichthyosaurs is we know that they gave birth to live young. And you might be saying, well, how do we know that? Let's take a look at this fossil. Take a look right there. Right? We've got this is essentially a mommy ichthyosaur that died during childbirth. Right? So we see that the ichthyosaur is still coming out of the cloaca, right? So, and this is not the only fossil that we see like this. There's several fossils where we see ichthyosaurs that died essentially giving birth. So that's a really unique adaptation for these marine reptiles. And next we can take a look at mosasaurs, which mosasaurs were definitely the absolute top predator in the oceans at this time. Mosasaurs only lived during the Cretaceous, and I think you can see by their skeletons they ancestrally are related to snakes. But what's really impressive about these guys is these guys are very efficient killing machines. They can be very long, up to 50, 60 feet in length. Some things that your book doesn't tell you about them is mosasaurs actually have 2 sets of teeth. So if you look at the jaw, right, if you were to look at the jaw, obviously there's teeth, right, on the end, just as you can see here in the picture. But there's teeth on the inside, right, up on the palate bone. If you were to touch your tongue to the roof of your mouth, that's your palate. And essentially what that is for is it's help holding those predators in place. So if you're a mosasaur and you're swallowing a fish, you want to make sure that that fish is going down head first. Because if you swallow it tail first, well, that fish is going to try to come right back out. So if you swallow it head first, right, it's going to go down. Now, you don't really have very long arms here, right? So it's hard to make sure that that fish goes down head first. So if you have this extra set of hooks in your mouth, then you can kind of use your tongue to manipulate that fish or whatever it is that you're eating to make sure it's going down the right way. Now, speaking of what it's eating, we actually know that mosasaurs were cannibalistic by what we find for the stomach contents. So I actually want to go back to this picture here for a second, because the other fossil on the other slide doesn't show it. But if you take a look here, you can see that there's a jumble of bones, right, in the stomach. Well, those are stomach contents. Bones don't really break down very well. And when we look at mosasaurs, very commonly we see that there's smaller mosasaur bones in the stomach, right? It's not giving birth to live young because we see acid etching on the bones, so showing us that it was partially digested. So this is definitely your top predator in the oceans at this time. Now, the last marine reptile we could take a look at are sea turtles. Sea turtles today can be pretty large, right? We talked about that one using gigantothermy, the giant leatherback turtle. But this guy puts him to shame. This is Archaeolon. It evolved during the Cretaceous, and from tail to head, it is 12 feet long. And this is a big turtle. The size of its paddle itself is about 5 feet, right? So this is a very large turtle, and I'm actually kind of sad we don't have them around today.